Goal for today is pretty simple. It's just to kind of take a look at our community. We have three big questions that we'll go over using some clips from our event with Pastor Lenny Duncan earlier this year. And we'll just hopefully have some rich discussion. So I do want to just share my screen really quickly and let me know if you can see this. Can everyone see the next steps that we have? Okay, perfect. So just to remind us of a couple of the things that ART, the Anti-Racism Task Force, had identified in conjunction with the congregation as possible next steps. There were kind of four main domains. We had education, which we're continuing to do through book studies, videos, etc. And I think we've done a really nice job of that, and there's a lot of interest, and that's an ongoing task. We also wanted to work on our language and our policy, which we have an awesome subcommittee working on. And I know that they're working on ways to work towards inclusive, but more so expansive language. And so hopefully we will get to hear more about that in the near future. One thing that we have not touched on quite yet is engaging kids at Central and making sure that we are being intentional in how we describe some of the symbolism and the stories in the Bible. And then this kind of bottom left one, call, ensuring that the ministry site profile uses inclusive language and encourages and welcomes candidates of color. That is one thing that we hope to dive into today, based on a couple of the things that Pastor Lenny Duncan shared. So does anyone have any questions about our kind of next steps and priorities that we had talked about? Okay, it's always good to just revisit those things. So if we are ready, then I'll go ahead and share my screen again. And we have a little clip from Pastor Lenny Duncan here talking about grace and diversity. So let me just make sure that I can actually get to it, because sharing your screen is tough sometimes. I have lots of clips pulled up. All right. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll watch the clip, and then I have some just a quick discussion question that I'm hoping we can do as a large group. And I will share that after we watch our clip. Is everyone able to see this one too? Okay.
I don't know, pick up a history book. It ain't great, right?
Whoops, I'll just start from the beginning.
When we gather in these ways, for some reason, since the Tower of Babylon, we create these oppressive, monolithic structures. And God always saves our ass with diversity. That's how he saved us at the Tower of Babylon. That's a story of grace. God blessed us with culture and diversity. Y'all think that's a story of destruction? That's a story of God saving us. Why? Because every time we gather in one place with one language, one ruler, what do? I don't know, pick up a history book. It ain't great, right? And how does God start the church? The same way, blesses us with diversity, meets us in our diversity, and brings us to oneness, right?
Okay, so I will pop this in the chat too, but one thing that I think is a nice exercise is just to think about how we as Central are blessed with grace and diversity. So I'm just curious to hear thoughts, and we'll start out just with large group discussion, and then we'll use breakout rooms later.
I was going to say that our open and affirming policy for decades has welcomed LGBTQ people in our community, and I think that that has served as a diversity in our church, and I guess that would be a big one for us.
I think the music that we've included in our liturgies and in our hymnology um, provides some diversity too, and actually provides a little bit of life and joy and excitement in many of the pieces. I think that really enriched this church. I mean, they were already doing it when Kathy and I joined, but it's just hasn't. It's enriched me.
I think also calling two pastors, maybe three, had females, I think has also allowed us to cross barriers that still lots of congregations struggle with.
I used to think of this story as talking about a problem where people couldn't understand each other. And it's wonderful to think of it instead as a blessing, where we are opening up our lives to other people, other languages, other ways of looking at things, instead of saying, oh my gosh, look at the terrible problem they had where they couldn't understand each other and stuff. So I like the idea of looking at this as a blessing. I know one of my white kids said once, the really good thing about our family was you couldn't be down on any peoples because there was one in the family at least. and so he was considering that diversity, or that even that size of the family, as a blessing. Made me feel good.
We have a history of working with inclusive language, and it's an ongoing process that we can continue to build on, but we already have that framework and willingness in the community to explore that.
I've always appreciated the diversity in age. That a lot of churches, maybe they're mostly older or mostly younger, and here it was a true blessing raising our children and now grandchildren in the church, where there are true ties across generations. And I am just thinking of Isaiah's special fondness for Karen, for example, that it doesn't happen in places where you don't have multi-generations, and that is a true blessing.
I was also going to say, and Verlon, I'm just going to say, it's always made me feel proud that we've, had a Black pastor at our church too.
Love those stories about Kansas City.
Always.
Verlon, I haven't heard the story about your swimming class in a long time.
Karen, were you going to say something?
I was just going to echo Kathy's comment that for me, that it's really special to have a place where I can get to know children, because all the children in my family are in the Midwest, and the kids at Central are my kids.
We've also had a tradition of encouraging mentally ill and physically disabled. We don't do the Saturday school anymore, but we've had, sort of a tradition there, and certainly our worship practices allow for older folks to be communed if they have, physical or movement difficulties and whatnot.
We don't often talk about economic diversity, but having grown up in a really small town and the only option was a public school. We were attending school with the doctor's kid, the plumber's kid, the farmer's kid, and we never had this sense that anybody was really rich or really poor. And I know that Central's really blessed with some very wealthy people, and we also have people, living in public housing. And I've also, appreciated that diversity as well.
I was going to dovetail on Adam's, just the diversity of the surprise welcome guest that comes in the middle of church from the, wanders in from the park. I mean, it's certainly, I didn't have that growing up, and it is, it's been a really great thing for me to learn from everybody in our community how to be welcoming and boundary setting, and and to see whoever comes in as a child of God. It's great.
It's great that we recognize that diversity is a richness. It's not an obstacle, it's a richness. It's why I think I like travel so much, is there's so much diversity, and that's beautiful to experience so many different cultures, different peoples. That's the beauty of existence.
I think hosting the community lunch in our building over the years has established the central building as a known place of welcome in the community for those who need those meals.
I know Jonna mentioned the diversity in our music, but there's also diversity in our liturgy. We're not afraid to try different liturgies and the diversity that brings to our congregation.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful sometimes to think about, what do we have? Because at least for me, as kind of a newer member, even though it's been a couple years now, some of these things like past practices I wasn't aware of. And so it's just nice to hear everyone's perspective on that and reflect on kind of the richness that we already have. And then tied up in that, I think, is the openness that we have to progressing forward. So one of the next clips from Lenny Duncan's event, I think that at least for the Anti-Racism Task Force really struck a chord, was when he discussed what would it take for your congregation to call a pastor or a leader that is Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. And so I think that's kind of really timely too, as we've finished the MSP, the call committee has formed, and we are in the works. So I want to share a clip that he's an exercise basically that he recommended in his talk, and then we'll go ahead and do it. So just listen to the clip, and then I'll put kind of a prompt in the chat after that. All right, and everyone can see this one too, correct? Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Can you make it safe for a BIPOC pastor to take over your church, right? Like if a BIPOC pastor took over today, what would be the things that they ran into? What would be the systems that they run into? What would be the policies they run into? And who would be the congregation members would be shitheads to them, right? Make a list, figure it out, strategize it. And those are the areas you need to start working on in your congregation, right? And your pastor can help reveal that, because your pastor kind of knows, like, well, yes, the money's handled by so-and-so, but really these 5 people, they kind of support us. And if we called someone like that, I think they would leave us. And so how do we have conversations with them and engage them and bring them in, right? Like you really need to think strategic like that, in ways that will only be proper for the council, or perhaps just the treasurer and the pastor. You know what I mean? And maybe like 1 or 2 people from an anti-racism team to talk to someone. And in a lot of ways that are going to be really interesting in the way, going forward. But you really got to strategize and think like that. So like, what would it be like if a person of color came in? So, and once you can imagine being led by a Black person, I swear to you, the rest of it will fall into place. There's a recent study that most multicultural churches fail. But do you know what the majority of them have? White leaders. hardly ever is it actually a BIPOC leader at these multicultural churches. And so it's very interesting, right? If you have a white leader trying to do multiculturalism, right? They may be doing a hell of a job, and it may be pretty wonderful, and you may be making a lot of progress, and people may be showing up, and it may be really authentic, and it certainly is worship to God, and it certainly is holy. But we find these congregations often balk when it's a Black leader, or when it's an Indigenous leader, or it's a Latinx leader. For some reason, these same congregations that were all about diversity when it was a white leader, things are very different. And so that's why I said, what would it take for your church to have a BIPOC or queer leader today? And if you're like, man, that would take way too much, make a list. What are those areas? And start addressing those lovingly as community, right? We need to start asking people, right? We need to start asking people, like, why are you like this? I don't understand. I love you. So many people are hurting. And we're really trying to grow and do something here.
Okay, so I just think that could not have been more perfect. He's basically telling us exactly what we need to do. So I think that it would be really wonderful if we could do just that and try to make a list. So considering the ways that we are ready to call a BIPOC leader, and then also considering the ways that we might not be ready, and really actually making a list. You can do it mentally, write it down, write it on your phone, whatever feels good to you. And then we'll go into breakout rooms and kind of talk about that, and then hopefully come back together and see, if we can get a physical list going. And I think if we have something down on paper or written in one way, then we can start addressing these things lovingly. So I will put in the chat kind of a couple things to think about. So how are we ready to call a BIPOC leader? How are we not ready? And then just really identifying concrete things that it would that we need to do in order to get there. So does anyone have any questions about that before we go into breakout rooms? No? Okay, let's see. I will go ahead and send us out then. We have 19 people, so let's do, maybe we'll do 4 breakout rooms, 4 or 5. Okay, all right, so I'm just going to assign them automatically, and we'll take maybe 10 minutes or so to kind of think this through. Again, feel free to write it down, and then we'll all come back as a group and share. Okay, opening the rooms. You should have been invited to join.
I wonder if you and I as hosts are not in rooms.
Oh, okay.
I don't think I'm in a room either.
Let's see.
Wonder if I can join a room. Oh, I can just click a button to join a room.
Okay.
It looks like. I'll do that.
Junie, I think you might need to press join.
Press join, okay.
Did it pop up? I can try to. There we go.
Okay, I'll go join room 4.
Okay, that sounds good. Pastor Maynard, it looks like you haven't joined either. Is there a button that says join for you?
I'll finish, Andrea.
Was in the middle of a phrase.
I do.
I'd be excited for someone who can challenge us from a gospel perspective.
Mhm.
That sounds great. Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm just, yeah, I would love for people to share what they talked about. If you're feeling like you don't want to share out loud, you can always pop it in the chat for other people to look at. But does anybody feel moved to kind of identify some things that were on their list or some salient points from your conversations?
I'll start ahead. Number of comments that came in out of our group or discussion. Well, let's see. One person said we've taken the steps. We have a, Black African-American pastor. We've talked about being inclusive and maybe even going to expansive when we do our welcoming statement at church. I think there's a lot of people that are they're involved in our church because of the inclusiveness of it. They like that aspect of it. But what are their hurdles? What are the kind of things that are keeping us? We might have BIPOC people, some in the church, some, but how involved are they in the functioning of the church? This is my own input as I'm thinking about who on our council is BIPOC. How many people are involved in the operation of it as opposed to being involved as members? And that might be a real adjustment to us that if we have a BIPOC pastor. Verlon is great. He's really involved in our education and the preaching, but we haven't really had much involvement BIPOC people in the actual administration and functioning the day of the church. Let's see. One person said that there really aren't that many, Black pastors that are ordained in the Lutheran Church, in the ELCA. Maybe there's not too many to choose from. Maybe those people already have congregations to be in, and that might be hard. Then another member mentioned, well, how about the diversity of other culture groups that could be represented? Let's keep that in mind. That net is wider than just African American people that potential candidates for to minister our church. So the underlying thing is we talk about diversity a lot, but can we walk what we talk? Can we walk the talk?
Oh yeah, way to go, Molly. Does anybody else have their drawings done? Anders and Eric are just sitting in there.
You can hear Sunday school. That's
But
nice.
one of the things that I shared in our group from a couple of perspectives, primarily when I was serving my home congregation in New York, and you've heard me talk about, we had 3 worshiping communities in one congregation, and the growing one was the Latino community. And in the ELCA, the Latino community is the fastest growing body in the ELCA. The difficulty is clergy shortage. They have no clergy and not enough clergy. And they even established, when I was there, Philadelphia Seminary set up a Spanish diaconia program, and I know Trinity became one of the teaching sites. And so there were deacons that were consecrated, and then in a number of them were given mission starts. And through the ELCA, there's kind of a fast track to ordination, and a number of them became ordained. But that's a concern, and I don't know if that is. I mean, picking up on what you said, Carl, I don't know if that is, which I think it could be a concern in the ELCA regarding the African American clergy. I know it was years ago, but there was only one black person when I was at seminary. Two, one from Africa, and then one in the States. And I don't know. I know it's changed, but I don't know how much. And I know, Verlon, when you were at Concordia. Where did you go? St. Louis? I can't hear you.
You're muted, Verlon.
Did you go to St. Louis?
Yeah, I was at Seminex and I was also at Luther for.
Oh, you were at Luther?
Yeah.
How many black were there when you were there? How many black students?
I think it was just me.
Yeah.
There's an African guy. There were more black students at Seminex than there were at Luther.
Yeah, yeah.
But those of us who were at Seminex are all retirement age now.
Yeah, I know.
And
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone, I don't know who came behind us, really. I haven't heard of that many. So it's not many.
I think the other hat that I would put on would be, as a transition, or initially called interim pastor, and the selection of clergy that are available, and levels of experience in for a particular setting, particular congregation. And I think Central would be one that, because of its location and its history and its ministry and mission, would the Synod would want someone with more than 1 year experience or 2 year experience. I know when I was on the call committee at University Lutheran, that's where Darlene is worshiping this morning. She's one of the readers. Anyway, there were a couple of people I was hoping we could get, but we were told they were kind of first call people and were not available. And the seminary and I think the powers that be, probably through experience, have realized that sometimes first call people may not be the best suited for the situation that can be really intense and involving. And that's a factor. That's a factor.
Erlon, I have a question for you. How do you think a BIPOC candidate would view the level of diversity that we have at Central? How would they look at the congregation, and how much would that influence their thinking about whether or not this would be a place they would want to come? Do you have any clues about that?
Well, I think any BIPOC person who went through seminary, who even went through their typical Lutheran system, would understand, would be aware of places like Central, that most churches would be like Central. That awareness comes from just going through the system.
And they'd be willing to take a chance on us.
Some would, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I don't even know if there's any all Black congregations anymore.
No.
Would you know, Mayor?
I don't. There are some, and I saw them in New York. There are a number of Black clergy in the Metro New York Synod, but that's New York. I think in some real urban areas like Chicago, probably LA, where it's more than Seattle of 700,000 people. You may see more there. I saw that in New York. I think one of the other things that Metro Synod, they had 28, 29 different languages being used in congregations. And so that you're going to see, I think, a greater diversity because of 8 million people. So you're going to see that. We're not in that population explosion area. Even if you want to talk about the greater metro area, you know, the East Side, and you're not going to see any black churches in the East Side. So it's a crapshoot in some respects. I mean, even you know, the question is gay clergy. You know, is that a consideration? That was asked of me by some people. Is Central open to a gay pastor? And I said, I don't think that's going to be an issue at all. But regardless of the person's color or orientation, you want to call someone that, I don't know how to say it without getting into trouble, that fits the qualifications that Central is looking for. That's the key. I mean, there have been some clergy that I've known that should never have been called. And I've seen some they're a hell of a good interviewer, but as far as serving a congregation, they're worthless.
I think one of the things that was poignant from the Lenny Duncan discussion for me too was kind of that he called out that these processes are very messy and we might not get it right the first time when you engage in anti-racism work and you take a risk, and sometimes it might fail miserably. And that's kind of what it takes to grow sometimes. So I think, at least in this discussion, what I think has started to happen, and I think it's happened in previous discussions too, is we have this prompt that is meant to kind of, guide us towards critical self-examination. And we kind of snowball out into, okay, well, there aren't many BIPOC candidates even. And it allows us to not really address kind of what we might need to. So how are we not ready to call a BIPOC leader, and what can we do to get there? I think Kathy put something in the chat that I would love for you to expand on, that I think is kind of really in line with what we were chatting about, if you want to expand.
Thanks, Anna. And I appreciate the discussion and also the call back to a more self-reflection. But we talked, and Erica was really great about kind of talking about examining our own ghosts. What's our experience with leadership? How have we responded to different styles of leadership? Has our pushback with some of our women pastors, has it been because we are used to a particular kind of white male leadership, and whether we have been at Central for a long time or came from somewhere else in another church, and then we were talking at the end about, that you always try to find that fit. And if what we're looking for in a fit is something that we're comfortable with, or is it someone who will challenge us? And if we're challenged, and Andrea was saying right at the very end, and you maybe heard her as we came in, wanting to be challenged grounded in the gospel, of our understanding of the gospel. How would we respond to those challenges? We might say now, yes, we're very open to calling a person of color or in a pastoral role, but where would we push back if they're more formal, if they're, how would we push back? And are we ready to challenge one another on that?
Yeah, just to expand on that, right? We probably all say that we'd be comfortable, but we need to uncover the ways that we are swimming in white culture. You've heard that phrase, right? In Seattle, we're especially swimming in white culture, but the reality is that that fit in an interview sense is often code for comfort and willingness to adhere to white culture. And so, how do we uncover those things in our own congregation? Maybe we're not even talking about a pastor. Maybe we're just talking about leadership within our own church, right? So, maybe there aren't candidates right now for this particular call, but how can we be open to having a more diverse council, for example, or other leadership positions in the church? And how do we, using those concept of ghosts, right, to uncover our ideas of who we are versus how we actually show up in the world as a community.
I think it's, at the risk of getting myself in trouble, I think it's important that we remember that, and this is piggybacking on Kathy's talking about ghosts, that we basically drove away our last two female pastors. There was a point at which they had been with us a number of years and we decided we didn't want them anymore. And in ways subtle and not, we got rid of them. So what does that say about us?
Yeah, I think that one thing we can continue to do is examine the power structures in our church and in our community, and how are we putting up barriers, either knowingly or unknowingly, for people to kind of, come forward and rise to the top. And let's see, Corey in the chat mentioned about, how we perceive language. And I think this is really interesting, the way that somebody is speaking to you. If they speak differently or, have a different vocabulary than what we're traditionally used to, what would that trigger our internal bias? I think that's a really interesting way to think of it too. Corey, did you want to say anything more about that?
Not too much, but I'll bring in the other point that we talked about at the end of having not just having a token leader, right, but really embracing whoever that leader is, and kind of going to Brian's point about we were not fully prepared to have female leader pastors there, and it's in this subtle ways that we undermine things. And I think, I mean, for myself and perhaps others, when we reverted back to having an old white male leader, there's a sense of like, oh, there's that male father figure again. We're kind of taken care of in that way. And, where, and I think it's in that sort of discomfort place that we're not prepared to have a BIPOC leader. But it's very subtle in the same way that languages that we may consciously know, oh, right, that person has all those degrees and they still speak in a way that I don't identify as educated, but that leans into the internal quiet bias in these small ways that we would be, a little bit turning away from what somebody says, even though our conscious brain says, no, I'm supposed to listen to them, but it pulls those biases forward. So, yeah.
I could echo that, Corey. I don't mean to use my experience going back to New York, but when I was there, the council had their first Latino president, which was kind of testy. And I don't know how many times I came very close, being an Anglo and a Nordic descent, and playing the race card against some of my fellow members because they were, and the cultures were blaring. And I know when I left, one of the things that I had suggested is that they call a bilingual clergy, and it took a while, and they did get one, and a Latino pastor who serves both congregations. But it's subtle, but it, like you're saying, it comes out at not the best times.
The thing about Central is that Central has a big political footprint in this community. And to get a BIPOC person who can move in those circles is going to be kind of difficult. And we may have to change the way we view things, or what we think is important, or somehow get across to that person that they're going to have to move in those circles. And some of the things it takes to move in that circle is white privilege. And so, I don't know, that's just something to consider.
Yeah, it sounds like, well, I had a third clip planned for today, but that's another conversation because this one was just so rich. So Pastor Verlon, I think it's interesting to hear about asking somebody to kind of move in our circles. And from what I'm hearing today, it sounds like we need to do some work to figure out how we can move in someone else's circle too. So as we do think about calling a new pastor, I think just keeping an open mind and realizing that we'll work together in tandem and kind of allow them to hopefully lead us in new directions. You know, if we have a foundation of where we want to go, then as long as we maintain this openness and be willing to try new things that feel uncomfortable for us, or push us in ways that we haven't been pushed before, then I think that we are moving in the right direction, hopefully. So we have just 2 minutes left. If I don't want to bump into worship, so if nobody else has anything to share, we can just go ahead maybe and close in a very quick prayer again. So, dear God, we thank you for this conversation and the thoughts that we shared today. We thank you that we have the ability to come together and sometimes share ideas that may be conflicting or may be congruent, and that regardless of that, we know that we are in this journey, on this journey together, and doing it and sharing our love for you. So we pray now that we may turn our hearts towards worship and continue to reflect on these ideas throughout the week and in all of the endeavors that are to come. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
There were three call committee members that were